Good evening and welcome to an Ashoka University event at Bangalore International Centre. Today we will have Rudrangshu Mukherjee, Chancellor and Professor of History at Ashoka University, deliver a talk titled Tagore and Gandhi in the Making of Modern India. In this talk, Professor Mukherjee will reflect on India's 75-year journey since independence. He will do so through an exploration of the significant bond between Gurudev Tagore and Mahatma Gandhi. Their deep personal friendship, one that sustained through many differences and disagreements, was cemented by a desire to build an India that was inclusive and free from hatred and bigotry. A renowned historian and author, Rudrangshu Mukherjee was taught history at the University of Calcutta and held visiting positions at Princeton University, University of Manchester, and University of California, Santa Cruz. He was the editor of the editorial pages of the Telegraph, Kolkata. Professor Mukherjee is internationally acclaimed as a historian of the revolt of 1857 in India. His first book, Awadh in Revolt, 1857-58, a study of popular resistance, has become a standard reference on the subject. Welcome Professor Mukherjee on stage.
Good evening. It's an honor to speak publicly in Bangalore. I say publicly because I've spoken once before, but that was at Manish Savarwal's residence to a very select audience. So it's good to be here and talk about what I think is an extremely significant and a relevant relationship and how that relationship matters to us even today. I will begin by two quotations to show what kind of relationship this was between the two individuals. At the end of December 1945, Tagore was already 4 years dead. Gandhi was visiting Shantiniketan. And in answer to a question, Gandhi said, "I have found no real conflict between us," meaning Tagore and himself. This is important, I started with a disposition to detect a conflict between Gurudev and myself, but ended up with the glorious discovery that there was none. Read this side by side with something that Tagore wrote 2 years before his death, July 1939. He wrote, "Though I have the imagination to conceive, I have not the power to carry out. Only a few men in the world have this power. And since our country has had the good fortune of giving birth to such a man, the way should be kept clear for Gandhi's progress. I certainly would never think of impeding it." Unquote. And a third quote from Tagore, 1929 February. He said, "Mahatma ji is the prophet of tapasya. I am the poet of Ananda." So from these quotations first, you can see how they addressed each other. Gurudev, so far Gandhi was concerned. Mahatma ji, so far Tagore was concerned. And the contrast also between tapasya and Ananda, that Tagore, he wrote this line in a letter very significantly to Mira Behen, who was one of Gandhi's closest associates, contrasting their different attitudes to life and to human relations as well. The more obvious point is that this was a relationship that was marked by enormous mutual respect and also a great degree of complementarity. But this relationship was also marked by a tremendous amount of disagreement and differences. I want to capture some of those differences here and come back to the complementarities and the similarities of their approaches and their attitudes and view of life, as it were. As all of you know, they were near contemporaries. Tagore being born 1861, Gandhi in 1869. It's a remarkable coincidence that two such individuals were born in the same decade, though in two different parts of India. But they did not actually meet physically, till March, the beginning of March 1915, by which time they were both not only formed individuals with evolving opinions, strong commitments, they were also famous in their respective spheres of activity. Tagore had already won the Nobel Prize. Gandhi had shown in South Africa how powerful satyagraha, passive resistance, and nonviolence could be. Gandhi was also a kind of a household name in India when in 1915 he decides to uproot his stumps from South Africa and come back to India. When he took this decision, for him it was a momentous decision because not very many people recognize this, and I'm saying this in the presence of Ram Guha, who was one of the earliest to point this out. He was a very successful lawyer in South Africa. He could have carried on being a successful lawyer in South Africa, but he decided that he would come back to India. As I said, he uprooted himself completely, just as he had uprooted himself from India to go and work and settle in South Africa. When he decides to come to India, there is a problem in his hands. He had set up something called the Phoenix Farm, where there were a lot of young children who stayed in that farm, worked in that farm, learnt in that farm, in the very special way that Gandhi wanted them to be educated, not a conventional school education. What was going to happen to these children? Where would they carry on their studies, their education? Education in the broadest sense of the term. This is where the influence of a third remarkable individual, and I think that the relationship between Gandhi and Tagore cannot be understood or appreciated without this third individual. He is a third, if invisible, side of the triangle. His name is Charles Frere Andrews, known in India as Dinobandhu Andrews. Dinobandhu meaning friend of the poor. A priest who had become a devotee of Tagore, wanted to teach in Shantiniketan. But before he could teach in Shantiniketan, he was sent on a mission to South Africa to help Gandhi. And he forms the link between Gandhi and Tagore. He is the person informing Gandhi about what Tagore was trying to do in Shantiniketan, and in turn also telling Tagore about Gandhi's experiments in South Africa and how momentous they were. So at Andrew's behest, at Andrew's suggestion, Gandhi takes the decision that the boys of Phoenix Farm would actually come to Tagore's institution in Shantiniketan. The boys moved to Shantiniketan, the children moved to Shantiniketan. Gandhi visits Shantiniketan sometime in February, but he can't stay there long enough. And Tagore is away at that moment from Shantiniketan. He couldn't stay long enough to meet Tagore because he received the news that Gopal Krishna Gokhale had died, so he left immediately and he came back in March. This is the first meeting. But before that first meeting, I'll come back to that first meeting in a moment. Before that first meeting, when the children have arrived and Tagore has welcomed those children, Tagore writes to Gandhi. This is a letter dated January 1915. This is the first letter that was exchanged between the two of them. They had a very long correspondence between 1915 and 1941. But this was the first letter. There's a very significant line at the end of this letter. Tagore, he is expressing his happiness that Gandhi has chosen Shantiniketan to be the home of the Phoenix Farm children. And he ends that letter by saying that the arrival of these children to Shantiniketan forms a bond in the common sadhana. He uses the word sadhana, in the common sadhana of both our lives. So already there is a recognition, even though they haven't met as yet. There is a recognition from Tagore that there is something common between him and Gandhi. And of course, Gandhi, by sending the children of Phoenix Farm to Shantiniketan, has already expressed his appreciation and his recognition of that commonality. They finally meet in 1915. By this time, Tagore has had a chance of seeing the children from Phoenix Farm. And in a private letter to Andrews, I don't think Gandhi was as yet aware of this letter. He later comes to know of Tagore's views, if not of this letter. This is what Tagore wrote to Andrews. Again, forgive me for another quotation. What little I have seen of the Phoenix boys, they are very nice. They have discipline where they should have ideals. They are trained to obey, which is bad for a human being. They are trained to obey, which is bad for a human being. For obedience is good, not because it is good in itself, but because it is a sacrifice. These boys are in danger of forgetting to wish for anything. These boys are in danger of forgetting to wish for anything. And wishing is the best part of attainment. And wishing is the best part of attainment. I want to emphasize this letter because the letter articulates what I think is the most significant theme of difference and disagreement between Gandhi and Tagore. They had many agreements, and some of those agreements were absolutely fundamental to their lives. I'll come back to that. First, let me talk about this disagreement and this difference. What was this element, this theme of difference? It was the idea of discipline, as this letter to Andrews makes out. The question that bothered Tagore, and in a sense was important to Gandhi as well, is how does one acquire discipline? neither of them underestimated the importance of discipline. But how does one acquire it? This is where they differed. Rabindranath or Tagore believed that discipline was something that belonged to the interiority of human beings. Human beings had to develop discipline from within themselves. Discipline could not be imposed. If discipline was imposed, then it was something superficial which could break at any point of time under strain. This idea had philosophical underpinnings. It goes back to Rabindranath's reading of the Upanishads, particularly a section of the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. Gandhi, on the other hand, as we know, often imposed discipline. If you look at how he ran the ashram, his ashrams in Sabarmati, Sevagram, there were always a series of instructions. This is how life should be led in the ashram. If you look at his mass movements, momentous and massive though they were, non-cooperation in the early 1920s, civil disobedience in the early 1930s, again, this is how non-cooperators should act. This is what civil disobeyers should act. Gandhi is laying down these modes of behavior, these modes of action. Tagore could not accept this. He could not accept Gandhi's emphasis on the charka. He said, you're making this a kind of mantra, as if by spinning we will attain Swaraj. He said, you are simplifying Swaraj. Swaraj will not be so easily attained. Gandhi, of course, was quick to respond to this. This is one of the many differences that he had. Tagore, again, had reservations about the way boycott and non-cooperation was being enforced, particularly during the non-cooperation movement. He said, if people have to non-cooperate, if people have to boycott foreign goods, they should do so themselves. They should realize the importance of boycott and non-cooperation, and not because a man called Mahatma, however great he is asking them to do so. And again, he emphasized that the enforcement of boycott, the enforcement of non-cooperation had implicit within it, the word enforcement has implicit within it violence, force. He objected to that. And it is because of that, similar reasons, he himself had walked away from the Swadeshi movement between 1905 and 1907, which he himself had been at the forefront of in 1905. And just as a passing trivia, when he objected to the enforcement of boycott and the violence that was implicit in the enforcement of boycott, he was completely isolated from the Swadeshi movement. And that's when he wrote that famous song of his, Jodi tor dak shune keu na ashe, ekla cholo re. If nobody answers to your call, walk alone. And that's what Tagore was willing to do during the Swadeshi period. And Gandhi, of course, many times in his own life, he made this song the song of his life. And many times in his life, he walked alone when he thought he should walk alone. The most famous example of that is his withdrawing from the non-cooperation movement after the violence in Chauri Chowra. The other point that Rabindranath emphasized to Gandhi was the so-called unity. I'm using the word so-called unity because that's what the term that Tagore used. between Hindus and Muslims that the Khilafat movement had brought about under the leadership of Gandhi. Rabindranath said that this is a very fragile unity. It will break down. And he was prophetic in this regard. So these were some of the issues on which they differed. And in all of them, as the examples I have taken, you will see that Tagore is emphasizing the interiority of discipline. And Gandhi, of course, because he has his foot on the accelerator of a mass movement, is saying, this is the way to go forward. We have to do this. There has to be discipline among the satyagrahis and among the civil disobeyers if this movement has to go forward, if this movement has to succeed. There's no right or wrong here. They're coming to problems from two different perspectives. But how did they express that disagreement? And this brings me to what I think is the substance of what I want to say here and how important that expression of that disagreement is for the making of India. How relevant it is 75 years after India became independent. First, the expression of the disagreements were open, in public. No hide and seek, no going behind the other person's back. They wrote articles which were published. In Tagore's case, in the Modern Review. In Gandhi's case, in Young India, and then later on in the Harijan. And also in letters that they exchanged. But even though they were private letters, with the permission of each other, they very often, more often than not, they actually released these letters for public reading. So I want to emphasize this, the openness of the disagreement. I can't emphasize this more, how important this is to actually disagree openly in public. Second, they expressed their disagreement without ever a hint of acrimony. They disagreed with respect. They disagreed with trust. And Gandhi, in fact, wrote once to Tagore saying, please disagree with me because you are a kind of touchstone so far I'm concerned. I want to know what you think of my ideas. So don't hesitate to disagree with me. And Tagore, in his own turn, said, hit back at me when you disagree, when you think I am talking utter nonsense. I don't mind. Our friendship is strong enough to take these kinds of exchanges. But there was never any acrimony, fall of respect for each other. They disagreed, agreed to disagree. And though it's not that important, as is to be expected from Gandhi and Tagore, they disagreed in the most elegant and the most lapidary prose. Just the style of their writings makes their correspondence, their articles worth reading. So I would argue, as a third point, by disagreeing in public in a non-acrimonious way, they were opening up a discursive space where one could discuss fundamental ideas, fundamental beliefs, and see how they could be resolved or how could they be put up for public debate. They could do this. And this is where I come to the fundamental agreements that they had. They could do this because their worldview, in many ways, in very significant ways, their worldviews were the same. They had similar ideas of what constituted Swaraj. They had similar ideas of who were important for the making of India. They had no doubts that it was the poor, the underprivileged, the impoverished who constituted the real India. They also believed that if India had to be free of British rule and a new India had to be built, that India should be free of hatred and violence and bigotry. These were their fundamental agreements. Because they had these fundamental agreements, and respected each other's views, they could articulate their differences on certain issues of political mobilization. Tagore and Gandhi left behind, through their differences and their agreements, left behind a legacy of public reasoning. And public reasoning is one of the fundamental features of democratic life. We have to debate and have to discuss and agree to disagree. And the founding fathers of the Indian Republic recognized this, and you can see how much they debated and how much they disagreed if you look at the debates of the Constituent Assembly. Every single issue that went into the making of that magnificent document called the Constitution of India was actually debated and discussed. This is how the Indian Republic was made. And this is how the Indian Republic continues to function or should continue to function. And this is the legacy of the public reasoning that Gandhi and Tagore left behind for us. I'm not for a moment suggesting that these two titanic individuals were the only two people to engage in public reasoning. There were others as well. One has to read the differences between Nehru and Gandhi, for example. His chosen heir, and how they differed on what should make for a modern India. And this is the legacy of public reasoning that has become part of India's journey of 75 years. Discussion, debate, disagreement. At Ashoka University, we are trying to encourage that idea of public reasoning by encouraging critical thinking and debate. We have only cast a small stone to create a ripple. With the help of all of you, I hope that ripple will become a tide that will enable us to re-energize Indian democracy and continue the legacy that Tagore and Gandhi left behind for us. Thank you.
The floor is open for questions. Please use the mic on the right side of the room.
So you've made that reference, I think, in the chapter on Gandhi. So I was just wondering if you could actually apply that to Tagore, because I've always had a confusion, because I've always seen myself as a world citizen, a citizen of the world, and that's what I identify most with Tagore. And I find his relationship with Hinduism a little complex during that time. So I felt that that part where you've actually applied the Max Weber principle to Gandhi would probably apply to Tagore, because I'm just trying to understand the transition from that period to Vishwabharati in 1921 and his disagreement with Gandhi on non-cooperation. Because at that time, Gandhi was becoming more nationalist in that sense, in a slightly loose sense, and Tagore was becoming more internationalist because he wanted a relationship with the West and so on and so forth. So that transition, I don't know whether I'm making sense, but the idea of disenchantment and that transition from, say, the late 19th century to 1921, where the differences are quite clear. And the last question, of course, is just speculative. Just wondering how you would look at Tagore and in today's world, in today's India, and especially in the context of the way we are moving. I mean, we seem to be heading more towards a Zia like Pakistan of the 80s, a Hindu version, of that sort. I mean, if I can be candid. So I wonder how Tagore would be looking at all of this.
So to take the Max Weber point first, I mean, Weber made this point when he was trying to discuss what happens when man sees himself or sees himself as somebody who exploits nature. The dichotomy between subject and object, the thinking individual, the conscious individual being the subject, cogito ergo sum, to take it from Descartes, the object being nature. And Weber was trying to say that before this consciousness, man lived in close proximity in his consciousness as well as in his life with nature. And there's a dichotomy that is taking place, that enchantment with nature is being lost because now human beings are seeing nature as something to be made use of or being exploited. Both Gandhi and Tagore wanted human beings to be close to nature. Gandhi makes this very clear in the Hind Swaraj, and Tagore, of course, in the way he builds Vishwabharati, where, as you know very well from the detailed accounts of Amartya Sen's autobiography, that classes were actually held in the open, in nature, under trees. So, closeness to nature. I think this is also one of they wanted to create, if I may use the Weberian term again, an enchanted world. Not a world where human beings lived in alienation from nature, but were united with nature. You are right that in the 1920s, when Tagore is embarking on his journey to build a world-class educational institution in Vishwabharati, he is seeking international cooperation. And this is precisely at the time when Gandhi is calling for non-cooperation. And Tagore writes this, expresses this difference very clearly to Andrews. He said, I'm not in tune with this non-cooperation. I want greater cooperation. The world has to move forward, humanity rather. The world is the wrong simplistic term to use. Humanity has to move forward through cooperation and reciprocity and not through non-cooperation. This is one of the very strong arguments he makes against the idea of non-cooperation. But Gandhi also, let it not be forgotten, makes that famous statement in response to something Tagore had written, not during non-cooperation, but later on in the 1930s. He said, yes, I want the doors and the windows of my house to be open on all sides and the wind to come in from all sides. But I refuse to be blown off my feet. I refuse to be blown off my feet. So Gandhi here again is emphasizing that there is a commonality and universality in the world of ideas in the Republic of Letters. But one should remain anchored to one's own identity, one's own tradition. This is not something with which Tagore was necessarily in disagreement. In fact, I would say he was very much in agreement, because many of the values that he sought to imbibe among his students in Shantiniketan had a fusion of Indian tradition and what Indian tradition could borrow, adapt, and use from the traditions of various other cultures of the world. What Tagore would have made, or what is happening in India today, is, I think, very clear from what Tagore wrote all his life. He did not want a closed India. He wanted, as did Gandhi indeed, he wanted the doors and windows of Indian culture to be open, not closed.
So would you be able to just elaborate on the difference in their thinking about education? I mean, you hinted that discipline was liked by one and not the other, but did they think a lot about school education or even college education?
Manish, first there's a simplification in something that you said here. It's not that discipline was liked by one and disliked by the other. Their ideas of discipline were different. Both of them appreciated discipline. And both of them also agreed that freedom, of which they were extremely aware and they were extremely conscious of the importance of freedom, they were also very conscious that freedom did not mean the ability to do anything one wanted. This is where freedom had an association or a linkage with discipline. Where that discipline would come from and how that discipline would be acquired, that's where they disagreed. Okay? It's not that Tagore said, you go and do whatever you want to do. He didn't say that. Okay? So, Tagore addressed the question of education more directly than Gandhi, because he set up an educational institution. An educational institution that admitted children when they were 6 or 7 years old and took them right up to their undergraduate years. And he attracted some of the best scholars internationally to come and teach. I mean, you just have to look at the people who taught in Shantiniketan during Tagore's own lifetime. I mean, it's a galaxy, and it's just unimaginable that in a small village some 30 miles out of Calcutta, a poet or a writer could attract such people to come and study. Artists, scholars, philosophers across the world, they came and taught students there. I personally know individuals who were taught in Shantiniketan in school, not just Amartya Sen or Satyajit Ray, who were the famous alumni of Shantiniketan, but common individuals who went to Shantiniketan to study as schoolboy. My father-in-law studied in Shantiniketan as a schoolboy, and I've heard stories from him of how this education was imparted. So Tagore had a a very definite view of education. And I like to think that Tagore's idea of education went back to the Latin origin of the word education, which is educare, going beyond oneself. Tagore believed that. By the way, I'm just repeating something that has already been now recorded and analyzed in an outstanding book by Swati Ganguly called Tagore's University. I mean, you are a book lover, you should have a look at this book and read this book. Gandhi's views on education are not that direct. Of course, he emphasized education. I mean, one has to read the diaries of Manu, where she comes to Gandhi when she is a teenager, and how Gandhi taught her various things. I mean, every day she would go for a walk with Gandhi, where Gandhi would teach her how to read the Bhagavad Gita, chapter by chapter. So Gandhi's approach to education was more individual driven rather than institution driven.
Thank you, Professor Mukherjee, for a terrific gem of a book. I'm curious, for the discussion and the debate, did either one influence a change of mind in the other? Are there examples where either Tagore or Gandhi changed their minds, changed a point of view because of the other? Thanks.
The simple answer to that would be no. Because their agreements were more fundamental. They disagreed on certain issues, but their agreements on Swaraj, on Ahimsa, on the inclusive and plural nature of Indian culture, these they agreed upon. So they could walk together towards these ideals, and when they differed, they walked alone.
Thanks a lot, sir, for a very interesting conversation. While we are on the topic of Gandhi and a relationship with an icon of Bengal, it's tempting to discuss the other icon of Bengal, right? Subhash Bose. And it's the relationship with Gandhi and Bose is well documented, or much is known about. I'm curious, what was the relationship between Bose and Tagore, and what was the role of Gandhi, if at all, in there? I'm aware of a few instances where Bose calls Tagore a Gandhi Bhakt in one of the, to use a contemporary parlance, in one of the letters about around the non-cooperation movement or after. So curious to understand that relationship and Gandhi's role in that relationship.
First of all, I'm a bit reluctant to use the word icon for any individual, whether it be Gandhi, Tagore, or Subhash Bose, or any other. The idea of an icon summons up the idea of blind faith, which, at least in my mind, and I don't think either Gandhi or Tagore would have liked to be seen as icons. Coming to a more specific question about the relationship between Tagore and Subhash Bose, Tagore very definitely wanted Subhash to have a second term as president without contest. Gandhi, of course, as is well known, was not amenable to this idea. And it's also a very interesting why Tagore wanted Subhash to have a second term. He makes his secretary, Anil Chanda, and you will find this in a book that Nehru edited called A Bunch of Old Letters. He makes Anil Chanda write to Nehru, saying that this is a message that Gurudev has asked me to pass on to you, that you should persuade Mahatma Ji to give Subhash a second term, because according to Gurudev, you and Subhash are the only two persons within the Congress to have a modern outlook. And you have done 2 terms. Subhash should also have his 2 terms without being put up for a contest against Patabi Sitaramaya. So Tagore had no qualms about his support to Subhash. But Tagore also wrote to Gandhi to say, I'm not a man of politics, but this is what I have to say. This is my personal statement in support of Subhash. Gandhi, in fact, wrote back, I forget, either to Vallabhbhai Patel or to Nehru, to say that the poet does not understand politics, as he himself has confessed. So he should not interfere in this choice between, or the decision not to give Subhash a second term. Not only that, when a very famous building in Calcutta called Mahajati Sadan, Mahajati meaning Mahajati actually, that is inclusive of all caste and creed, a building for that, when that was set up by Subhash Bose, 1938, he had Rabindranath come as the chief guest to inaugurate that building. So there was a kind of affinity or affection between Tagore and Gandhi. And Rabindranath was, from all evidence that we have, was upset by the way Subhash was put in a corner by Gandhi, Patel, Raja Gopalachari, and so on and so forth.
Good evening, sir. After the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, we were all aware of the reaction that Tagore had towards that incident. He was quite upset and he did return his knighthood as well, eventually. So, but on the other hand, Gandhi's reaction towards the same event was a bit more, I mean, he was more silent towards, his reaction wasn't that it wasn't very provocative. So, could you elaborate a bit more on why Gandhi was silent during that time?
So actually, it's not true that Gandhi was silent after Jallianwala Bagh. He leads the Congress Inquiry Committee into Punjab to look into what had actually happened. And he uses the Jallianwala Bagh as a kind of springboard for his non-cooperation movement. The Jallianwala Bagh wrong, the Khilafat wrong are the two of the issues that, and the third being Swaraj, that Gandhi raises for launching the non-cooperation movement. But having said that, one thing we must appreciate is that the massacre took place in April. The full extent of what had happened at Jallianwala Bagh and after Jallianwala Bagh in Amritsar and in other parts of Punjab was not well known or not even known at all till the end of May because of the censorship, because of martial law in Punjab. when Tagore gets a trickle of information about the massacre, even before he has put in his famous letter relinquishing his knighthood, he sent Andrews to Gandhi as his own personal emissary with the simple message that let the two of us, that is Gandhi and Tagore, meet in Delhi and walk into Punjab. We will be stopped, we will be arrested, but this will be the beginning of a protest. Gandhi, very politely but firmly, told Andrews, please explain to Gurudev that this is not the right moment to do so. We need greater preparation if we are going to launch a mass movement against British rule to overthrow British rule. Tagore was very disappointed by Gandhi's response. So he went to the most important Congress leader in Bengal, Chittaranjan Das, and he said that call a public meeting to condemn what had happened in Jallianwala Bagh. Das refused to call such a meeting. He said, if you want such a meeting, you are eminent enough to call it yourself. Why do you want me to call it? So Tagore realized that there was a reluctance even on Das's part to come out in the open to condemn what had happened in Jallianwala Bagh. And then, after this meeting with Das, in a night of complete anguish, utter anguish, he drafted and sent that letter, the very famous letter, relinquishing his knighthood. So one must remember this complete story. And of course, within 1 year of Jallianwala Bagh, a little more than 1 year, Gandhi launches the non-cooperation movement. So Gandhi is already thinking ahead of how to mobilize the people on these three issues: the Jallianwala Bagh wrong, the Khilafat wrong, and Swaraj.
Thank you, Professor, for very lucid understanding of Tagore and Gandhi and some of their thoughts. What I wanted to ask you was, I actually, from whatever we heard just now, I'm not finding a dissonance in the discipline, in the word discipline, between the two ideologies. One thing, because, self-discipline comes with awareness, it comes with evolution and all of that, if you want self-discipline. But when you're leading a cause like Gandhi was leading with so many people that, are just living on subsistence level and don't have the time to internalize, then discipline has to get imposed from outside. Would you agree with that?
Much more importantly, Tagore wouldn't agree with that. This is where he disagreed. And most importantly, as time would show, that imposed discipline could actually be very transient and very fragile. The history of India between 1920 and 1947 shows that and continues to show that, if I may add. Thank you.